So today's lecture is part of our Center's Maxine and Jonathan Marshall speaker series on religion and conflict. Now, the Marshalls were dear friends of the Center, and they had a long-standing concern to promote solutions to the pressing conflicts of our age. They are responsible now for a lecture that's been in existence for 15 years. This is our 16th in this series. Now, most people who come to Center events don't end up endowing lectures as they have done, or aren't in a position to do that. But I do want to say something about the extraordinary accomplishments that are made possible when people come together and make smaller contributions. So I wanted to just point out one brief example of that. If some of you have seen this ASU Thrive magazine, on the cover is this a Somali student who at ASU who came to the United States as a refugee from a Somali refugee camp in Kenya. She was separated from her mother for 11 years when she came here to Phoenix, and then enrolled later at ASU and became a fellow in our undergraduate seminar. If you want to read an extraordinary and inspiring story, pick up a copy of this. I think we have some extras out there. Extraordinary. She was a fellow in our undergraduate research fellows program a couple of years ago, and that is a program that is funded entirely by donors and members of the community like you. So I have to say thank you, thank you, thank you. Her story is amazing because she's amazing all on her own, but also because of what the program that we run here will enable her to do and has already enabled her to do. Now, Narora is not here today. However, we have with us the entire class of 2019 undergraduate research fellows from the Center who are all over here. Would you raise your hands there, please? And I would also like to take this opportunity to ask those of you who are friends of the Center and who have contributed to this wonderful program, that is anyone who's ever made a donation to the Center, to please raise your hand at this time. Okay, thank you. Now, I'd like for all of you to at least have an opportunity to meet one another at the reception afterwards so you can appreciate fully both what the contributions that you make are able to do and also who helps to make these programs possible. So, all right, sorry for going on so long about that. I will now get to the main event here. We are so pleased and honored to have David Gushee with us today. He is one of the world's leading Christian ethicists, and if you don't know, that's a field that's committed to understanding the wisdom of different religious traditions and offering insights for resolving and thinking about pressing problems of the age. In Professor Gushee's case, issues of race relations, gun violence, climate change, many, many issues. He's a distinguished university professor at Mercer University, where he also directs their Center for Theology and Public Life. And he has authored, edited, or co-authored some 23 books and 150 articles and book chapters, which is quite a lot more than I've ever put together. He is also a very prominent post-evangelical, or sometimes called ex-evangelical, who has been singled out for good ways and for not such good ways. He's been targeted by many people that have put him in this position. But he has been a voice of clarity, of moral insight, and of great moral courage throughout his career, but particularly in the last 4 to 5 years. And you'll have an opportunity to hear some about that. I think one of the ways to introduce him, I've known him for a long, long time. And we first met when I was in graduate school, actually. And I thought a great way to introduce him was to just let a few of his words speak for themselves. So I'm going to read just a paragraph here from his most recent book. If we're talking about the American Christian landscape since 1978, I've pretty much seen it all. I was raised a post-Vatican II Catholic, became a Southern Baptist through a mystical teenage conversion, became a Baptist minister, almost abandoned the whole thing for Episcopalianism, discovered liberal Vatican Protestantism by full immersion at Union Theological Seminary in New York, almost lost my faith studying the Holocaust, met evangelicals I really liked, met evangelicals I really didn't like, became a Christian ethicist, got a teaching gig at a school that tested my convictions, hung out briefly with really powerful evangelical leaders, helped them figure out some things about abortion and racism, went to a small evangelical college, got involved in national environmental and anti-torture activism that embarrassed that university's leaders, moved to a moderate university where I was initially distrusted as too conservative, got dazzled and then a bit disillusioned by Barack Obama and his people for a while, became everybody's favorite liberal evangelical, changed my mind about gay people, wrote a book about it that got me in trouble with a lot of evangelicals, got elected president of the American Academy of Religion, the Society of Christian Ethics, worked against Donald Trump, and taught Sunday school every week to recovering addicts and professors and everyone in between. He sums it up by saying, when it comes to bitter cultural divisions fueled by religion, I'm Forrest Gump. For whatever reason, I've been in the scene where the conflicts are, where red and where blue meet. Like Waldo, if you just look hard enough, I'm there. I think David's words give you the best picture of who he is, and that's a far better introduction of him than I could have ever put together. Now, what I did discover just right after reading that paragraph when I was reading his book is that he also keeps a very, very detailed journal. And this journal goes back to the 80s. And it's a journal that includes all of his correspondence, all of his conversations with people, all of his encounters, and all of these controversies. And then I started thinking, oh boy, what's he got on me? Because it's apparently quite detailed. So I hope David goes easy on me today in what he has to say. So I've said too much already. It's time to turn over the podium to our distinguished guest. Would you please welcome me? And please join me in welcoming David Gushee. The title of his talk today is A Crisis in American Christianity, ? How Scholar Practitioners Can Engage the Current Moment.
Well, it is good to be here. Thank you for turning out, and thank you, John Carlson, for the invitation. This center is very impressive. I run a center which consists of my office and an administrative assistant, nothing like this. So it is an honor to be the 16th lecturer in the Maxine and Jonathan Marshall speaker series on religion and conflict. That is an honor. It's been a great day here. I've gotten to meet some awesome students and colleagues here, and it is good to be here. I have never been to Arizona State University, but I thought I would tell you about my first exposure to the concept. In the mid-1970s, I grew up in Northern Virginia, which is very far from here. But I thought Arizona State University had really cool football uniforms and was just kind of like an exotic desert place. And so I remember getting an ASU football jersey and wearing it to gym class on a memorable day, my sophomore year in high school, when we were playing murder ball. Did any of you ever play murder ball in school? I don't recommend it at all. It's a game where we took the basketball court, and the others it was divided in half. Our team was on our half of the basketball court. Their team was on the other half of the basketball court. And the idea was to take a big rubber ball, like a kickball, and throw it at each other at full force so as to disqualify. If you couldn't catch the ball and got hit by the ball, you were out. I was on the front row, and I was wearing my ASU jersey, and a very strong, powerful person ended up having the ball across the line and coming at me, and I was terrified, and I knew I couldn't escape, and I was face down on the floor, and the person was getting ready to throw it at me, and I ducked, but I was already flat. You know what happens when you duck on a basketball court and you're already flat? Your teeth shatter. So I ended up having major dental repairs required that day with blood all over that ASU jersey. So I want you to know, so far nothing that bad has happened to me here at Arizona State. And you all are redeeming the ASU experience for me. And I want somebody to send me an Arizona State University jersey so that I can wear it again, and the trauma of my youth can be healed. But so far the experience, I am feeling healed already, but a jersey would help. So send it to me at care of Mercer University in Atlanta. So I want to talk a little bit about the kind of talk I'm going to give today. I told the students to look for this part. As Dr. Carlson mentioned, I am a Christian ethicist. I work from within the framework of the Christian tradition. So most of my writing has been written from within the Christian tradition, using the thought categories of the Christian tradition in order to help Christian people live better than we might otherwise do. So it's a project from within the church for the church. I've also, as John mentioned, been within the vast American evangelical community for most of my career. Perhaps as many as a third of the American population. If you throw a rock, you'll probably hit an evangelical, but you shouldn't, because that's against the law. Okay, so don't do that. But there are evangelicals everywhere, and I spent many years of my life as a self-identified evangelical and as a leader in the evangelical community. But I've spent a lot of my time helping evangelicals think about the nature of our public engagement in the American public square. I believe that public engagement is at a point of crisis. So what I was going to do today was mainly talk about the crisis. Start there. But I think that the American evangelical political engagement is so disastrous right now that it would be better to start with a vision of what I think Christian public engagement should look like in any culture, and then talk about what went wrong, and then narrow down to the conclusion that I think we're at a moment in the American evangelical political engagement that can only be described as a crisis. And then we'll see where we go from there. Does that make sense? So if you are not a Christian, if you are a person of another faith, a lot of times when I use the word Christian, how Christians should engage the public square, it could also be translated how religious folk should engage the public square. But I need to speak in my own specific theological framework to do the kind of work that I'm doing right now. And so we'll be kind of working in that language space a little bit today. So here we go. Here is a proposal for 7 marks of a healthy Christian political engagement. Each I will outline briefly and talk a little bit about where I got this idea, and then move to the next one. And then after that section, I will talk about evangelical political engagement in the U.S. since the rise of the new Christian right in the 1970s, and then talk about what went wrong there and how it went wrong, and how we got to the moment that we find ourselves today. So a little bit of kind of theology of public engagement to start off. First mark, and students, you will be tested on this. So as will everyone else. So 7 marks of healthy Christian political engagement. First, maintaining a distinctive Christian identity and not succumbing to civil religion. A healthy Christian politics is contingent upon Christians and the church being utterly clear about the distinctness and primacy of their identity as Christians, as followers of Jesus, over against all other identities and loyalties. Christians are, by definition, those whose baptismal promise is to follow Jesus in all contexts and circumstances. Churches are communities of baptized Christians. Christians and churches live in various nations under various political regimes, but for Christians, our primary communal identity must be as the church, and our primary personal identity must be as followers of Jesus. Any political engagement that we offer must come from a clear identity core. This is much easier to say or to propose than to accomplish and maintain. Because human identity is multifaceted and many identities tug at the loyalties of Christian people or anybody else. Especially in nations where Christians have had numerical majorities, and most especially in nations where Christianity has been the official state religion, Christian identity has very often been hopelessly merged and confused with national identity. This is routinely disastrous for Christian witness because Christians who are confused about their core identity often abandon the teachings of Jesus for the demands of other lords, notably of the nation. So the first mark of healthy Christian political engagement is to maintain a distinctive Christian identity and not succumb to civil religion. The second is to maintain hope in God that is not based on the outcomes of earthly politics. A healthy Christian politics is driven by hope and not by fear. This is hope in God, not hope in the state, not hope in political parties or particular politicians. There are various ways of describing the nature of this Christian hope, some that are more expansive than others. In my own theological work on the proclamation of the reign of God by Jesus, I have argued that the hope that Christian people should adopt is Jesus' own hope, that God was in him intervening in human history to inaugurate the kingdom of God over all the earth, a kingdom which one day will be fully realized. This kingdom of God we can only see now in glimpses of moments where we see advances in peace and in justice, in deliverance of the oppressed, in healing of the broken, and restoration or inclusion of people in community. The church is that community of people who participate alongside Jesus in working toward these kingdom characteristics, these kingdom marks until Jesus returns. Christians can and often do choose to engage in earthly political activities as one arena in which kingdom of God advances can be achieved or at least moved toward. But hard experience teaches the church not to identify specific policy gains or losses with the kingdom of God. Also, that political engagement always involves compromises and half wins or two-thirds losses. That over-investing hope in the political arena leads to a wide variety of temptations and seductions. It also can weaken the church's distinctive identity and attention to its own lived faithfulness to the way of Jesus. I've been talking all day, so a little water. Christian history offers numerous examples of Christians losing their way in this regard. We have often embraced a politics of fear rather than hope, and on other occasions we have bought into a politics of hope, but it has been hope in earthly politicians, earthly political parties, and policies, rather than in Jesus' promise that God will bring in the kingdom in God's own time. Third, maintaining a critical distance from all earthly powers and not surrendering to partisanship with or to partnership with the state. A healthy Christian politics knows that the church must remain at a healthy critical distance from all earthly powers. The church is not a partner to the state. The church is not to become identified with a political party. And the church must never offer uncritical loyalty or moral surrender to a ruler or politician. I picture the ideal relationship between Christians and earthly politicians with a spatial image. I picture the church as in one place and the ruler as somewhere else, both within a particular political order. If given the opportunity, the church sends its representatives to speak to the ruler or other state officials. When in the presence of such officials, the church's representatives are entirely independent, humble but not obsequious, and straightforward in their goals. Church leaders articulate the convictions of the church and then withdraw. They do not They do not strategize with politicians, form alliances with political parties, make partnerships with the state, or surrender their independence and convictions in order to retain access. Christian and world history reveal many things that can go wrong here. Church officials have often proven susceptible to the benefits of access to politicians, including money, fame, and power. Church leaders have more than a few times traded the proclamation of a clear and challenging word for easier, happier, and more lucrative access to state officials. Christians have also become so loyal to a politician or party that we have forgotten, misplaced, or surrendered coherent Christian social and political convictions. Politicians are generally far less interested in hearing Christian moral convictions stated in their presence than in co-opting Christian influencers for their own purposes. They feign interest in the former while pursuing the latter. And of course, at times, states turn directly hostile to integral Christian witness, blocking access to rulers or even turning on the churches in persecution. Keeping that possibility always in mind helps to discipline a healthy Christian politics. Given the church's routine capitulation to secular powers when granted access to them, it is easy to conclude that the best situation of the church in relation to the state is a distant and even insecure one, at least if a central concern is to protect the moral integrity of the church. That was 3, right? 4, maintaining a discipline provided by a Christian social teaching tradition. A healthy Christian politics brings a rich social teaching tradition rather than ideology or improvisation into its public engagement. The church, taken as a whole, has a profound body of teachings to bring to bear on nearly every social, ethical, political issue that might arise in contemporary life, as well as on the broader meta-issues of how Christians should engage politics. This tradition is too good, too rich, and too constructive to leave it behind. Consider the image of a vast library. Picture one of those grand old British estates with a library running from floor to ceiling in a big room. When Christians, clergy, scholars, or churches are called upon to address specific problems today, they should spend some time in that library before they leave their Christian spaces to go talk to rulers in their spaces. Any church group of any substantial history has made some contributions to this epic library. The oldest traditions, Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic, and mainline Protestant, have produced the most resources for it. In my experience, the best organized and most accessible body of Christian social teaching available today is found in the Catholic Church, including the modern papal encyclicals, Vatican II documents, and the Catechism. Not coincidentally, when Catholic leaders are called upon to address state officials on various issues, generally, they draw from this social teaching tradition and do not improvise. The advantages of undertaking Christian political ethics from within the discipline of a social teaching tradition are many. One is that most issues are not entirely new. When new challenges related to old issues arise in such areas as family life, war, and economics, there is no reason to reinvent the wheel. The churches today can and should draw upon the resources that the church as a whole has already developed. And when entirely new issues arise, such as reproductive technology, at least perhaps the principles and methods attempted in the past can be put to use. Because no source in Christian life is infallible, these resources from the library of Christian political thought are not infallible, but they are indispensable as part of the treasury of our shared experience. Consulting them can prevent a multitude of sins and stupidities. 5th, a global perspective, not parochial or nationalist. A healthy Christian politics takes a global perspective in 3 senses. First, we think of ourselves as part of the church universal and draw on the social teaching resources of the global church across its history. We are a part of the global church, as confessed in the creeds. We are responsible for our connection to that global church, and we humbly and gratefully draw on the resources of that global church. Second, those about whom we are concerned in our public engagement should include all the world's citizens and the creation itself. The social teaching tradition itself continually directs us to a globalized rather than localized concern. The biblical teachings that all are made in God's image, that God loves the peoples of the entire world, and that Christ died for all, can discipline us away from narrower and more parochial visions. Third, based on hard-earned lessons of history, we are taught to explicitly reject a political vision damaged by racism, xenophobia, or nationalism. We repentantly recall the numerous times that the church has fallen prey to such ideologies, and we hope to do better in our own day. Honest repentance for past sins is an important part of a healthy Christian politics, as Jennifer McBride so powerfully has argued in her study of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's social ethics. It is far easier to retain a global perspective if actually and concretely attached to believing communities in multiple countries, and if this connection is routinely experienced and emphasized. This gives multinational churches a distinct advantage over national or regional or merely local church bodies in helping them to avoid nationalism and parochialism. It is important for all Christians to cultivate global connections as extensively as possible. 6, the vision for the common good, not the church's self-interest. A healthy Christian politics concerns itself with the common good. This is an aspect of the modern Christian social teaching tradition that becomes obvious upon even the most limited inspection. It is a point of consensus, not of argument. But it is also a matter in which the church has routinely fallen short because the church, and particular churches, are also human institutions susceptible to selfishness and narrow visions of the good. Imagine again the church sending its representatives into the lair of the state. The church ought to do so with a message that is primarily governed by kingdom purposes and directed toward the common good. Thus, the bishop tells the ruler, please attend to the poor. The pastor tells the president, please look after the sick. The denominational leader tells the Department of Homeland Security, please provide humane provisions for refugees. Why all of this? Because the church exists to follow Jesus and to advance God's kingdom. Marks of the kingdom include justice, peace, deliverance of the oppressed, healing, and merciful welcome into community for those who need it. The church, in its public-facing witness, ought to scan the horizon near and far, looking for those whose needs for justice and peace, for deliverance and healing, and merciful welcome into community are most acute. The church then advocates for such as these when and where it has an opportunity to gain audience with the state. Now contrast this vision for Christian politics with a different one. Imagine a church that uses its access to rulers in order to advocate for its own self-interest. Give us, we say, better and broader tax exemptions. Go easy on our pastors when they are accused of molesting children. Expand religious liberty rules so that we can discriminate against people in our businesses and charities. Give us the best seats at the table when you convene religious leaders. Tell everyone that our religion is the national religion. This is a hopeless corruption of Christian political engagement. The church's public witness must be about the common good, not special pleading. And then 7th, a people who practice what they preach, not hypocrites or load shifters. A healthy Christian politics emerges from faith communities of holistic integrity which attempt to practice what they preach. Everything that these churches ask the state to do, we ourselves are already doing within the range of our mission. Thus, when we leave our spaces to go to government spaces, when we ask the state to serve the poor, to care for refugees better, to support families better, we are able to point to all kinds of things that we are doing, the lessons that we have learned in the very same enterprises related to the common good. We are not approaching the state to ask it to do what the church should be doing, but is not. Knowing the difference between the mission of the church and the state, we do not ask the state to advance Christianity. We do not ask the state to prefer Christianity, formally or informally. We do not ask the state to silence the church's critics. If we live in a country like the U.S. that sets limits on state support of religion via its constitution, we support those provisions. We do ask the state to advance the common good, to foster justice, peace, and human dignity. We are aware of overlapping spaces here, and these overlaps are sometimes a bit difficult. We do not ask the state to do our job, but neither do we discourage sufficient tax collections for the state to do its job, which is a common problem among libertarian Christians. Just because we can serve a few poor in our churches doesn't mean the state is off the hook for its work. Just because we can create small care healthcare operations doesn't mean the state can evade its larger systemic responsibilities. The church's public witness is hollow if we are not practicing in our life and on our scale what we are asking the state to do on its turf and its scale. The integrity of Christian political ethics is directly related to the integrity of church life and Christian discipleship. Okay, so those are my 7 marks of healthy Christian political engagement, part 1 of my talk. Now part two. This is where it gets juicy. Where evangelical politics went wrong. You ready? Strap in, friends. All right. It is at last time to bring this generalized description into contact with the evangelical story in America since the 1970s. I'm afraid the results are not pretty. My claim is that white evangelicals started down the wrong road with the Christian right in the late 1970s and then tumbled over the cliff with Donald Trump in 2016. But now the situation has reached a point that can only be described as a confessional crisis. Self-identified evangelical Christians began engaging modern American politics in a significant way in the late 1960s and early 70s. Ironically enough, it began when the peace and justice evangelical left took the rebel side in the street battles of the 60s. And some became engaged in supporting the Democrat George McGovern for president in 1972. Evangelicals for McGovern, imagine. My friend Ron Sider was the president of Evangelicals for McGovern. Even though I was long a part of the evangelical left and support their political convictions for the most part, some of the weaknesses of evangelical political engagement were present on the left as well as on the right from the beginning. But still, evangelical left partisan political activity was dwarfed 2 elections later when a coalition involving figures such as Jerry Falwell became engaged in Christian right politics, which included strong and public endorsements of Republican candidate Ronald Reagan over born-again Democratic President Jimmy Carter. This inaugurated a now 40-year entanglement of white evangelical leaders and their people with the Republican Party, an entanglement that eventually, I think, has resulted in a GOP plus white evangelicals identity fusion. It is at least arguable that in the beginning, the preachers and the politicians knew who was who, and they were not the same. In other words, Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, and their ilk intended to be operating from Christian identity and to be pursuing Christian goals, while GOP operatives like Richard Viguerie knew that they were political operatives pursuing secular partisan goals. They met to consider a coalition of convenience, not to fuse identities. Evangelicals would support the GOP in its hawkish foreign policy in the context of the Cold War, and libertarian economics, low taxes, low regulation. And the GOP would support evangelicals in their family values agenda, such as opposition to abortion, feminism, and homosexuality. The fact that militaristic foreign policy and libertarian economics are not easily defended by Jesus followers was left to the side. Falwell, Robertson, and the like spoke often of a return to God and a Christian revival in America. In the beginning, at least, they were not interested in Republican victory for its own sake. They supported Ronald Reagan and eventually Republicans in general because these politicians promised certain policies that the Christian right pastors believed important for the national return to God and to Christian morality that they sought. The first mark of a healthy Christian politics, I said, was distinctive Christian identity. I am allowing that at least arguably this was present in the beginning of the Christian right. However, many of the fundamentalist and evangelical preachers had a particular understanding of America that made a blurred identity and a default to an odd kind of American civil religion almost inevitable. Instead of a globalized vision oriented to the common good and influenced by the kind of kingdom theology I've discussed, they had a nationalist vision oriented to American exceptionalism and, in some cases at least, grounded in a confusion between biblical Israel and modern America as God's people. Taking hold of numerous Hebrew Bible covenant passages about promises and warnings, these were directed by the prophets of God to Israel back in the day, but Christian right preachers transferred them over to America. Texts like 2 Chronicles 7:14 became pivotal. Have you heard it? If my people who are called by my name humble themselves, seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land. On the Christian right interpretation, this was directed from God to America. Israel became America. America's supposed earlier blessings from God were attributed to earlier obedience to God that was now lost, mainly due to the population drifting away from God, led in that drift by godless liberals in the judiciary, academia, government, and media. If America could be restored to the Christian right's version of biblical faithfulness, God's blessings would flow once again. For Falwell and the like, God's covenant partner is America, as it was Israel in Bible times. If the Christian right preachers had taken Jesus' kingdom or the New Testament in general more seriously, they might have avoided this error. If they had reached into the great library of Christian social teachings, they could have seen how often this move has been made and how often it has been abandoned as proving out as disastrous. Notice that this odd civil religion has no distinctive role for the church. This is a particularly good example of the fallout of evangelical coalition building since the birth of modern evangelicalism in this country in the 40s. No coherent theology of the church survived in the Big Tent fundamentalist evangelical coalition, making this abysmal Christian right theological aberration of America as Israel and Israel as America a possibility. By the way, I'm not even talking about Christian Zionism about Israel. I'm talking about America as the new Israel. This kind of evangelical political engagement was not disciplined by the global Christian social teaching tradition. And evangelicalism did not have its own social teaching tradition. Instead, a naive reading of select Old Testament texts ruled the day, leading to an interpretation violating several of the marks of healthy Christian politics described above. This America equals Israel, biblical Israel, move might have been made easier because of the social location and anti-liberal politics of these preachers and their enthusiasts, especially in the backwash of the late 60s and early 70s. Anybody here remember what it was like in this country in that time? Uncritical patriotism among a lot of white people in America is as American as apple pie. Patriotism can easily turn to nationalism, which I would simply sketch as patriotism on steroids, patriotism even more uncritical, parochial, and sometimes xenophobic than garden variety patriotism. One context in which patriotism tends to turn into nationalism is when one's beloved nation feels like it is under sustained attack or criticism. The goodness of America was indeed under sustained criticism in the period in which the Christian right was being born. The feminist revolution, sexual revolution, civil rights movement, anti-Vietnam rebellion, the protests against Richard Nixon and Spiro Agnew. Did you think you'd hear the name of Spiro Agnew tonight? With his concern about nattering nabobs of negativism. The student movements of all types, the long hairs, the hippies, the peace signs, the drugs, all these were criticizing America as it was. While the evangelical left supported many of these critiques and these movements, the Christian right opposed them bitterly. This was the core of what divided them. This was the period when the America that we now know, a country split inexorably along red and blue lines, was born. White evangelicals and fundamentalists were from the beginning deep red, disproportionately unsympathetic to every blue social reform and social protest movement of the period. Their earlier crew-cutted patriotism now became more hard-edged, bleeding toward nationalism. Cold War anti-communism certainly helped the cause. Southern evangelicals in particular were looking for a government that would slow down, stop, or reverse itself when it came to mandatory racial integration. As historian Randall Balmer has argued, the Southern preachers who became interested in Ronald Reagan and in a Christian right coalition were attracted to the GOP's Southern strategy and to the idea that a vote for the GOP was a vote against federally mandated racial integration, especially of their Christian schools. So white racism and resistance to anti-racism is an important part of the Christian right story. Consider now where we are at this point already by 1980. Christian right politics lost a distinctive Christian identity early on, if it ever had it, due to America as Israel theology. The Christian right embraced a vaguely Christian American civil religion, but updated it in the context of the first stage of what we now call the culture wars. This slipped easily into nationalism, which we might now more provocatively call white, anti-liberal, anti-social reform nationalism. This politics did not have a global perspective. It was parochial. It was nationalist. It was not disciplined by the Christian social teaching tradition. It understood the common good too narrowly. Along the way, the other marks of a healthy Christian politics also disappeared. For example, Christian hope alternated with despair depending on who won each presidential election. When Republicans won, it was time for hope that America will come back to God. When Democrats won, it was time for angry despair, nostalgia for the good old days, and a fight to the death. There was no theology of incremental social improvement or kingdom advances. It was all or nothing, victory with the GOP or apocalypse with the Democrats. The idea that God might be trusted to be working in history regardless of who wins presidential elections withered away. As hope in God weakened and the culture wars settled in, and the Republicans and Democrats became more Manichaean in their outlooks, critical distance between evangelicals and the GOP collapsed. This was true not just for the Christian right's leaders, but for white evangelicals as a whole. The Republicans were the only real functional hope left for the America that white evangelicals wanted to create or to restore. Evangelicalism gradually became a political identity and not a religious one, or not only a religious one, or confused with political. As the Democratic Party became more secular and less sympathetic to evangelical concerns, and as court rulings steadily went against the convictions of the Christian conservatives, evangelical churchly self-interest now also seemed to rest in the hands of conservative presidents and the judges they appointed. Increasingly, evangelicals looked to GOP administrations to secure religious liberty as they understood it, to protect their schools and colleges from non-discrimination statutes, and to protect them culturally against what they saw as a tide of secular disdain and delegitimization. Increasingly, to be white evangelical just was to be Republican. And meanwhile, the Republican coalition increasingly depended on a massive white evangelical base. In fact, during this time, the Republicans began shedding some other kinds of Republicans who weren't comfortable with all of this. So the symbiosis became complete and fully mutual. The evangelicals needed the Republicans, and the Republicans that were left needed the evangelicals. Since the late 1990s, 20 years, I started when I was 12, I have pleaded with white evangelicals to resist these trends. I have called for various versions of the 7 marks of healthy Christian politics: a distinctive Christian identity, placing hope in God alone, critical distance from earthly powers, grounding in the broad Christian social teaching tradition, a global perspective, a kingdom perspective, a common good orientation, practicing what we preach. I have failed, as have others who made similar arguments. It's been gradual, but today we have Donald Trump as president, supported by 81% of white evangelicals in 2016, and 75% as I write this talk. So the third movement of my talk is shorter. It's under the frame, Evangelical Trumpism, is this a confessing church moment? Where have we arrived now, fully 40 years after the rise of the Christian right, and 70 years after the birth of neo-evangelicalism? We have arrived, in my view, at a crisis of Christian politics that requires us to reach into one of the worst moments in all of church history for a parallel. And so I take you back to the first days of the rise of Nazi Germany. After Adolf Hitler was named Chancellor of Germany in January of 1933, the entirety of that nation, all of its people and institutions, had to decide how to respond. That included the churches. Hitler began with the political legitimacy of having come to office through legal means. Within 6 months, he had managed the abolition of democracy and the rule of law, but that critical starting point of legitimacy helped him do so. Note that Adolf Hitler's highest vote total in a free and fair election before 1933 was 37%. You don't have to have a majority. The German Evangelical Church, the official state Protestant church, was in a process of reorganization and centralization. This was convenient for Hitler. In his effort to consolidate control over all major social institutions in Germany, he intervened in that church process. He and his church supporters maneuvered to get a Nazi named head of the church, Reich Bishop, to get the church to support state anti-Semitism, including as it affected the church itself by barring clergy and faculty members of Jewish descent from church positions. And in general, his goal was to neutralize any political resistance that might arise in the Protestant church. In what became known as the Kirchenkampf, or German church struggle, the German Evangelical Church split. The official Nazified church, which became known as the Reich Church, prevailed. The resistant church that became known as the Confessing Church, which never had a majority of the German Protestant pastors, did put up pretty stout resistance at first, but over time was gradually hounded into greater and greater weakness. Leaders of the confessing church included Karl Barth until he was forced back to Switzerland, and the young, very young, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. We honor people like Barth and Bonhoeffer today, but their tribe of radical anti-Nazis was quite small, especially once it became very costly. The Barmen Declaration, issued in summer of 1934, is one of the high points of this group's resistance. Everyone should read it. But even when you read it, you find that it was mainly a theological clarification of the identity of the church and saying to church leaders and state officials, back off with messing with our doctrine and our church order. But look what happened. A highly learned Protestant church in the land of the Reformation, having as resource some of the world's finest theologians, divided over the basic question of whether to allow Nazis and Nazi ideology to affect the policies and doctrine and order of that church. And more broadly, whether official state racism should be allowed to determine who its own clergy should be, whether Nazi dictatorship should be supported, whether concentration camps for dissenters should be overlooked, whether a professional civil service should be Nazified, whether the murder of political opponents should be accepted, whether clergy should offer an official oath of allegiance to Hitler personally. Ultimately, whether Hitler was God's gift to Germany to restore German greatness, or whether his policies violated core Christian teachings. And again, this church, the German evangelical church, had in its ranks some of the most sophisticated preachers and scholars in the entire world. And still, they largely failed. There are many lessons to be learned from the early Nazi period, but I will simply say this. A Christian church of that level of sophistication in history that was not able to figure out whether Nazism should be supported or resisted raises questions about whether the life and teachings of Jesus were playing any substantial role in church life when it ultimately came down to it. And now we think about a community of people that cannot be described as among the highest level of theological sophistication in church history. White evangelicals, my own former tribe. I am wondering whether it is fair to say that in relation to Donald Trump, white evangelicals are playing the role of the Reich Church today. Certainly not the confessing church. Now again, I speak, it's so important whenever one even ventures in this ballpark to talk about what you're talking about. I'm speaking of 1933, not 1943. I'm speaking of the beginning of the period of seduction, not genocide and World War. What began, in my view, as a well-intentioned, though deeply flawed Christian right politics, now involves a surrender morally to a person whose character and policies violate every tenet of Christian personal morality and every historic tenet of the historic Christian social teaching tradition. Ongoing support for this president in the name of Jesus as God's leader, despite everything, I believe is the end result of a path that began more innocently 40 years ago. I believe we are already in an American church struggle, our own Kirchenkampf, and that we need an American confessing church. For me, one of the best reasons to leave American evangelicalism is that it has become the Reich Church of our era. I believe that it is an all-hands-on-deck moment for scholars of religion, conflict, and politics, as well as for religious leaders. It's a moment in which we all need to do our part, our scholarship, our advocacy, our preaching, our teaching. This is not about being liberal or conservative, Republican or Democrat, hawk or dove, libertarian or statist. Some of the most compelling voices in the public square today are Republicans. It's not about that. It's about the survival of American democracy and the rule of law, but it's also, from a Christian perspective, about the survival of a coherent, reasonably faithful religious engagement with politics in this country. It's about the coherence and faithfulness of Christian faith. So we all have work to do. For me, I believe that American evangelicalism has been hopelessly compromised. I don't think there's any renewing it. And so I am trying to help millions of disillusioned ex-evangelicals find a better way forward. And so that's the direction that my work is taking. If you look at my resume, there's a lot of books with an evangelical this and an evangelical that. It's over for me. What I'm working on is trying to think about, if you have been in that community and are wondering what faithfulness might look like now, my scholarship is now intended to try to serve that community. And I believe that is the most important contribution that I can make to American public life at this time. And so, thank you for your attention.
Okay, we have time for questions, and I think we even have a microphone for questions. We need a microphone passer-arounder. Okay, very good. So we'll move across the
You want to
room
recognize
here.
the people? You recognize the people, and I'll just
Yes, I
answer.
will. And if you, yeah, there we go. Okay, very good. Elise.
You speak for obvious and good reasons of the white evangelical community, and I understand why, and I think your points are very powerful and well taken. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to what we refer to as the mainline denominational enterprise. How does your thinking apply, and what are you thinking, and what would you say to those of us who don't come out of an evangelical tradition but yet share the biblical Christian tradition and what we tend to call the mainline denominations?
Sure, yeah. First, for those who aren't familiar with the landscape, just a little bit of rough numerical sketching. I mean, the mainline Protestant traditions include the churches associated. The entire staff of the National Council of Churches is like less than 12 people now. They used to occupy the entire building of what's called the God Box.
475 Riverside Drive.
475 Riverside Drive. So the institutional strength of the mainline churches has weakened. But there's still something to be said. And also, the mainline churches do have greater contact with this global social teaching tradition that I'm talking about. And they do have the connection, the World Council of Churches, and thus the globalized vision. I think that because a lot of mainline churches are declining in number, and because there are political divisions in mainline churches, this does keep pastors quieter sometimes. And I know a lot of mainline ministers who feel like, I'd like to be able to speak out about, name the issue, immigration or race or nationalism, but I'm afraid that I'll lose that part of my congregation, right? And so this is an issue in any politically divided congregation. And also, the political tribalization and polarization is so bad that even when a minister simply tries to articulate principles, like we need to be about the common good, or xenophobia is bad, then somebody thinks that it's a political attack on their favorite politician, and then they get in trouble that way. So if I were to switch it around in terms of the Democratic Party would do well to strengthen its connections to sympathetic religious leaders and to be willing, for example, political candidates, be willing to explicitly identify the moral and religious underpinnings of their policy proposals. Sometimes they do, often they don't, because the Democratic Party has so much more of a secular voice than the Republican Party does at this point. So, but I think it's a lost opportunity. So all of this is to say that this kind of political fusion with a political party hasn't really happened on the mainline side. The succumbing to a kind of a personality cult around one person hasn't happened on the mainline side. The contact with the broader global Christian social teaching tradition is still there. There are resources to be drawn upon, and currently they are not being adequately drawn upon. And I call on the mainline churches to fulfill their role and their potential in articulating Christian values in the public square. The question was, has the evangelical and Republican fusion basically damaged Christianity? It has. Any partisan identification of a religion, especially in a divided society like ours, inevitably alienates people who don't share the politics, right? I have noticed a dramatic difference in my students. Hey, students. I have noticed a dramatic difference in the last 15 years. And there's polling that reveals this, and it continually is reaffirmed in other polls. America's young people, and not just young people, but disproportionately young people, are becoming more secular and more suspicious of Christianity because Christianity is identified with all this junk. So if you want to anti-evangelize the American population, if you want them to become more secular, pursue politics in the way that it's been pursued. It is a great way to de-Christianize the American population. And I think that's what's happened. So part of what I'm trying to do in my work now is to say, what, in a sense I've always said, but now a little more urgently, this is only one version of Christianity that we're seeing on display here, and not an especially good one. And so let's talk about other variants and other versions. When people who are raised evangelical, if they decide not to give up on Christianity and they go out and look for other churches, they find, often to their pleasant surprise, that there's a lot else out there that isn't what they've dealt with, and that there's fresh breathing room to think new thoughts, and that religion hasn't always been identified with one politics, right? And some religious communities don't think about politics much at all, right? And all that, it's all fine. So that is definitely the case, that this is damaging the brand of Christianity. I tell my students who are ministerial students, for some people, whatever you project as Christianity is the only version of Christianity that people will ever encounter. So if you've made it toxic, then there'll be people who will never darken the doorstep of a church again. And so it is an urgent missional challenge for Christians to get disentangled and to do better in the public square.
Okay, where are the questions? Oh boy, we're going to do a sweep here and then come over to a few students. Okay.
Yes, if I were a liberal Christian at this point, based on what you said, would I assume that all the problems are with the conservative Christians? Are there any, it sounds like all the virtue is on others other than the so-called white Christians, or I would just say Christians. And so I'm just wondering if you're going to write a book that maybe covers that would also indicate there are other problems in other types of faith or way, say, liberal Christians carry out their social work or their views or whatever.
So the question is basically, are there problems on the liberal Christian side too? And have I or will I write about that? I have, actually. I think that that in general, the polarization, red, blue, I do think 1968 is a really good marker of kind of, are you with the reformers, the change people, or are you with the resisting side? Is interesting because, from my perspective, if you're testing social change against the Christian social teaching tradition, not every change has been a positive one. So, for example, the doubling of the divorce rate in the 1960s, the 1970s, left a lot of disaster in its wake. And while the divorce rate has not continued to rise, the culture around marital stability and permanence has been permanently weakened. I think that's a problem. And it's a problem that liberal folks don't like to talk about too much because they don't want to appear judgmental. Okay? I think that the routine resort to abortion does not fit with the Christian social teaching tradition, far from it. And so even sometimes religious celebration of abortion, I think, is not in keeping with that tradition. It's a problem. I think that the routine use of mind-altering drugs is a problem. And this came from the liberal side of the 60s revolution. I think that some aspects of the sexual revolution, in terms of the chaos and instability of relationships and the, I don't know, sexual revolution was supposed to bring liberation for everyone, but in some contexts it just brought new forms of exploitation, such as mass-produced pornography. That's a problem. So sometimes if you hear like Christian leaders attempting to be politically relevant, but they're more liberal, they just sound like they're echoing Democratic Party talking points. And that's not okay either. If you could tell from the first part of my talk, I believe in a sturdy, robust, independent Christian voice. A church that knows who it is. In this sense, the kind of Stanley Hauerwas emphasis on church is relevant, but it wasn't only that. There's a whole broad tradition. The difference with Hauerwas was he wanted disengagement. I want disciplined engagement. But engagement where you know who you are and you know who you're not and you know how to set proper limits. And one thing that has helped me here is having been courted by Democratic Party politicians, I know what that feels like on that side. And the idea that, you know, what politicians want from religious people and leaders is endorsement and votes, not advice. I discovered that on the Democratic Party side, right? And before that on the Republican Party side. So hopefully that helps, sir, that there are problems on all sides. I think that the particular crisis moment we find ourselves in leads me to where I went tonight, but yeah, there's problems on both sides.
All right, we're going to go here and here.
The same crisis of de-Christianization is happening in Europe. I know you're talking about American, but would you have any views on the similarities or differences between the two?
So the question about de-Christianization in Europe, complicated. I'm not a specialist in this area, but I think that if you think about Western Europe, de-Christianization happened largely because of secularization, modernization of ideas. But I don't think it was mainly about the church messing up in its politics and disillusioning people. I think it had a different trajectory, a kind of an intellectual trajectory of skepticism about the core ideas and doctrines, biblical authority and church tradition and that kind of thing. The whole, you know, the rise of Enlightenment questioning and skepticism, the rise of modern science and all of that, the kind of Western intellectual tradition. What I'm talking about in the U.S. is still a largely religiously oriented people, but when they see what has happened with religiosity, it's turning people off. Maybe a parallel to Europe would be the formerly Catholic nations, like Ireland and Poland, where the church has had a considerable amount of power, and sometimes its use of that power has been oppressive or misplaced or corrupt, and it has turned people off in that way. So I think it may be more like that. And also, if you think about the Eastern Orthodox lands, like Ukraine or Russia or Romania or Serbia or whatever, the entanglement of church and state in those countries was already disillusioning. You have to talk about the communist period to then add that layer to it. I think that even people who are not believers appreciate when they see a public engagement that strikes them as having integrity and justice, orientation, and a commitment to the common good and discipline. When they see it get all about churchly self-interest and narrow agendas and oppressive misuse of power, people just know that for what it is. It's corrupt. And what we were talking about is the corruption of a certain kind of Christian politics. And that can happen and has happened other places.
We're going to go Tracy, Al, and then over this way.
Thank you so much for your talk. Evangelicalism, of course, also carries with it an imperative to convert. And it sounds like in leaving evangelicalism, you've also left that behind. Your interests are not in converting others to a particular brand of Christianity. I was struck by your very poignant story about your efforts over the last 5 years to talk sense into your fellow white evangelicals, and those efforts having failed. And I think those of us in this room are, for the most part, extremely sympathetic to your view, which is so compelling because it's coming from a Christian perspective, even though I would guess that most of us are not coming from that Christian perspective. Most of us here, if this is a typical group at ASU, mostly non-Christian, secular, post-Christian, searching, what have you. But this isn't a Christian room, which you knew when you came in. So your message is compelling to me, and I imagine to many others, because it does come from a Christian witness. So how can those of us who don't share that witness advance your program, which we do find very compelling, advance your critique of white evangelicalism?
Buy all of my books. That's where we begin, right? Let's be clear about that. I think that part of what's happening in the evangelical world is a hunkering down, in the sense of you're either in or you're out. If you're out, your critique doesn't matter. So if my critique doesn't matter, and I was like evangelical super dude there for a couple decades, and now I'm the enemy, the critique from secular folks or whatever people of other religions is just going to bounce off. In fact, one thing I didn't mention, I should have, is that evangelicals increasingly have a persecution narrative going. We're being persecuted by all those bad people who want to hurt us, and Trump is protecting us from them, right? So that's so piling on probably doesn't help that much. But looking for ways to strengthen values-rich public conversation, the norms and practices of civil society and a healthy democracy. These are all things that come to mind, and other religious traditions. If you're a part of another religious tradition, another religion, looking for ways for the leaders and the people of those traditions to speak into the public square out of values that are profound within those traditions. But I think on the critique side, it's mainly going to bounce off. Yeah. And then, did I mention buy my books? Okay.
I'll get part.
I'm a follower of the way of Jesus, so I'll start with that. But it seems to me that it didn't take the church very long to get associated with government. And I think you are perhaps a little too kind to the historical theology, because we bought into Augustine and concepts of original sin. We bought into Anselm and concepts of substitutionary atonement. We bought into Jesus as the only Christ, and now and then we have gone through tremendous struggles and are still going through them as to how we deal with science. And now we're on the other side of evolution and quantum physics, and the church doesn't quite know how to deal with all this other stuff and be in the postmodern world. And so I think this is a confession moment, because I think there's a paradigm shift going on in religion in general as we try to look at our past and shed some of the things that we bought into that no longer make sense. And to begin not to be so dualistic, who's in, who's out, we, they, but see that God is more ubiquitously present in everyone, and there are gifts from all faiths.
I'm noticing in the post-evangelical space competing trajectories. Some are, you might say, liberalizing their theology and kind of sounds like some of the direction that you're talking about, abandoning certain things that were understood to be core elements of Christian doctrine in the past and moving a new direction. Maybe towards a more interfaith theology or multi-faith theology, a more, how about humble, we don't know a lot, but we do know this kind of theology. More spiritual, mystical theology, post-Christian but not post-spiritual. So there's that. And I'm going to talk about some of that in my book. And there are a lot of people who are finding meaning there. I am still a little more traditional in my theological formulations than that. It may be related to a Catholic turn in my own thought. But I think that the church made a lot of wrong turns, but I still want there to be a recognizable thing called the church that people can affiliate with meaningfully and commit their lives to, with a body of doctrine that they can hang their hat on that still works for them. And so there is a move towards a fresh reclaiming of a critically engaged tradition. That's more the direction that my thinking is going. But it would have to be a critically engaged tradition, not a uncritically, the grand church tradition of the past. There are errors all through that tradition, sometimes disastrous ones. I'm concerned that for some of the people that I consider, you might say, I'm an ordained minister, so though I may not be as evangelistic as I once was, I still care about the spiritual well-being of people, including adrift post-evangelicals. I'm concerned that the path to a kind of a liberalizing and spiritualizing of theology is the thinning out of the content of the tradition to the place where there's not much left for them. And it's hard to live a life based on that. That's my concern, for the young especially. I think that sometimes for people who are a little bit older, a kind of a thinner theology but a thick ethic works for people. Like, I don't know what I believe about all this theology, but I know what right and wrong is, and I can hang my hat on that. I think that may not be enough for people who are forming now. They need, I think, something sturdier as a theological base. That is at least my intuition.
We are over our time, but I want to make sure we get get some questions in from our students. So I'm going to ask for both of your questions and then let David respond to both of them. And if you didn't have a chance to ask a question, he is not going anywhere. We won't let him leave until ever. Well, he does have a flight later tonight, but we won't let him leave until he has an opportunity to answer your question. So first to Sophia.
Hi, I'm just curious, where do you draw the line between not imposing evangelicalism onto other people and voting for the common good and advancing Christian interests and God's kingdom? Because there is a distinction to be drawn there. How far is too far? How much is too little? And I mean, for example, there is a debate on whether or not creationism should be taught in public schools. Is that too far or too much in your view?
So I started looking into the work of a man named Ernst Zundel, and he made a quote. The quote was, there's no such thing as anti-Semitism without Semitism. And he made reference to various things in the Talmud, various doctrines which advocate a high degree of ethnocentrism on the part of Jews, even criminality, to the extent of exploiting Christians and considering them to be unclean, comparing them to animals, even legalizing certain forms of what would equate to rape in our current legal context. How should I put this? In Revelation 2:9 and 3:9, the Messiah Jesus, he talks about the synagogue of Satan, which say they are Jews and are not and do lie. Throughout the past, whether it be Nazi Germany, the Germany of of the Weimar era, or whether it be the United States, we can see a sort of voracious ethnocentrism that is, and a concentration of power in the media and in finance, whether it be in Nazi Germany or pre-Nazi Germany, or in the United States. And this influence in both cultures was overall degenerate. We have a pornographic culture today. We have insane amounts of moral degeneracy in the United States, which is very similar and comparable to that which existed in Nazi Germany. So in recognition of the big theological differences that exist, that might even be satanic within the doctrines of certain Jewish sects, and the obligations of the Christian world, what should be the Christian view towards the Jew in the modern day, given how much power that they do hold in our society?
Yes, it's the last question. The easy ones, saved for last.
To the second questioner, it has been a long time since I heard that kind of language about Jewish people. Okay, that adds an interesting layer of complexity. So let me just say that because I don't accept the terms of the question, I don't know how to answer it. Okay. For the first question, my idea of the kingdom of God is the way I arrived at that and it wasn't just me. When you study the New Testament, especially Matthew and Luke and Mark, you see a reference to Jesus came preaching the kingdom of God. And so then in a previous work, I studied what did it appear that he was drawing from for this proclamation. And so anyway, through a process of scholarly study, concluded that what Jesus had in mind was essentially the social justice transformation of the world, right? And that this was consistent with Jewish hope. That the biblical hope was a hope of social transformation, a world where there's no more murder, no more war, no more injustice, no more suffering children, no more tears, right? And that what Jesus did partly was to broaden this and universalize this hope. And from that proclamation, I think it is possible to derive at least major elements of a social ethical witness in culture. And if that's what you're going for, then it leads you towards a certain kind of political vision that is not about getting people to teach creationism. It's about more justice and hungry people being fed and health care for everybody and no more war and no more rape and no more abuse and all of those things. Just it's about the humanization and healing of a broken world in the name of God. And so that then becomes the content of a kind of a common good hope. Interestingly, when you actually look deeply at the social, ethical, political tradition of modern Roman Catholicism and the modern mainline churches, at least there, that is essentially the hope that is offered, but there's other elements too. And that is the hope that I am pursuing and that I think we ought to be pursuing. The other thing about a common good formulation is it invites other people in regardless of their starting point. You may believe in God or not, but you probably believe that it would be better to be living in a world where every child was safe, right? Believe in God or not, but you'd like to live in a world in which you didn't have to fear nuclear annihilation. So the common good is a consensus-building kind of hope, and a hope that we all ought to be able to get our minds around. Here might be my final critique of the right, of the Christian right today. They narrowed their hope. They narrowed their social ethic too small. to no more abortion, as well as a lot of other stuff that I think ultimately wasn't much worthy of that common good tradition. So one thing we can all come together around, I hope, or most people, is that dream of a renewed world. And however you get there, let's pursue it together. Thank you very much.
David, I want to thank you for your very agile and deft intellectual transmission that is able to shift gears like that among very different kinds of questions, for your wisdom and for your deep, deep thought, for giving us all something to think about no matter where our starting points are, and for inviting us to think in more hopeful ways. I think it takes some time to digest what you've shared with us today, and I hope that will continue to give us all something to think about in the coming days. So, as I said, if you didn't have a chance to ask your question, please bend Professor Gushee's ear outside there in the secret garden. See, you got me thinking. I almost got it there. Okay. Just want to make sure you're still paying attention. Okay. Would you please join me in thanking Professor Gushee one more time?